Hello, everyone, and welcome to Hidden Histories, Rediscovering the Federal Art Project at the St. Louis Art Museum. My name is Mary Oken, and I am the Living New Deal, or L&D, Assistant Director. If you're new to L&D, we have been around for about 15 years, beginning as a research project in the Geography Department at UC Berkeley and growing into a nonprofit organization of national scope. Our mission is to document, map, teach, and advocate for New Deal history, primarily through our website, www.livingnewdeal.org. Our website shares the largest inventory of New Deal sites ever to be created, almost 19,000 New Deal sites and counting, which is assembled through the generous support of private donors and with the help of ordinary people and researchers all across the country. Would you like to become one of them? To join our national New Deal scavenger hunt or encourage your friends, family, and students to do so, please search our website for New Deal sites in your area and do some digging to see if any are missing. Chances are that you'll find some that are. I'm delighted to share that this year and next, we'll be making major upgrades to our website thanks to a 2025 Digital Humanities Advancement Grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities. It is an honor to be selected for this award, and we look forward to rolling up our sleeves to make our website even better. Living New Deal's donors also support our public programming, such as tonight's webinar. Like our website, all webinars are free to the public, and you'll also find recordings of them on the webinars section of our website and on our YouTube channel. And now for tonight's webinar. As the leader of L&D's Advocating for New Deal Art Initiative, or ANDA for short, it has been my great pleasure to meet with members of the New Deal Art Studies community over the last couple of years and to recruit leading scholars to serve as ANDA advisors. Together with the ANDA Advisory Board and other collaborators, Living New Deal is working at the forefront of new contributions to the field of New Deal art studies, organizing webinars, such as tonight's conversation, organizing conference sessions at national scholarly meetings that examine the New Deal art and public works legacy, creating a special issue of a scholarly journal. Look out for the New Deal themed issue of Source Notes in Art History this spring, and most recently organizing the first scholarly convening to consider the interconnections between New Deal public art of the 1930s and Comprehensive Employment and Training Act, or CETA public art in the 1970s, both too often forgotten eras of government-sponsored art that a small group of scholars, artists, and students will be exploring in San Francisco next month. All of this is to say that as we celebrate the 90th anniversary of the Works Progress Administration's Federal Art Project this year, and think about the future of government funding for the arts in the 21st century, it is valuable to consider stories of the New Deal that help us understand local people and places, such as regional museums that become stewards of New Deal art. While the New Deal art programs made the American government the single largest patron of contemporary art in the world, when the programs were defunded in the early 1940s, no clear plan was established for what to do with the thousands of art objects created all across the country. With shifting taste and lack of oversight, many New Deal artworks were destroyed or lost from the public trust, but in some cases, local institutions have protected them. But protecting artworks is not the same as sharing them with the public, and the storage vaults of many museums are where New Deal art objects tend to live, rarely, if ever, seen by the public. At Living New Deal, we were delighted to learn about the work of art, the Federal Art Project 1935 to 1943, a new exhibition featuring works from the permanent collection of the St. Louis Art Museum, or SLAM for short, on view through April 13th, 2025. If you can, please go and see it. Tonight, we welcome two speakers in a conversation about the research, design, and ideas behind SLAM's The Work of Art exhibition. The exhibition was co-curated by a dynamic duo team, Dr. Amy Torbert, SLAM's Associate Curator of American Art, one of our speakers tonight, and Claire Cobesa, SLAM's Curator of Prints and Drawings. Amy will be sharing insights about the exhibition on behalf of their dynamic duo in conversation with Dr. John Ott, Professor of American Art History at James Madison University and one of LND's Advocating for New Deal Art Initiative Advisory Board members. Both John and Amy are vibrant voices in the field of American art and share an interest in furthering exciting new directions for all of us to consider. Here is a bit more information about each of them. John Ott researches and teaches the art history of the United States with particular attention to artwork by and portrayals of African Americans, as well as art markets and collecting. Among his books are the forthcoming Mixed Media, The Visual Cultures of Racial Integration, 1931 to 1954, University of California Press, to be released in fall of this year, and a new book project titled Return to Sender, Race and Iconoclashes Over New Deal Murals, 1934 to Present. Amy Torbert is SLAM's Andrew W. Mellon Foundation Associate Curator of American Art. She earned an MA from Williams College Graduate Program in the History of Art and a PhD from the University of Delaware. Prior to arriving at SLAM in 2018, she held curatorial fellowships at the Yale University Art Gallery, Harvard Art Museums, and Philadelphia Museum of Art, and research fellowships from the Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art, the Smithsonian National Portrait Gallery, and the Terra Foundation for American Art. At SLAM, she has co-curated Art Along the Rivers, a bicentennial celebration in 2021, and along with Claire Cobesa, the work of art, the Federal Art Project, 1935 to 1943. John and Amy, welcome and take it away.
Thanks so much, Mary, and everyone out there in Zoom land, wherever and whenever you are, thank you so much for coming and joining us this evening. If you don't know much about curators, they wear about 84 different hats, a very complicated job with lots of moving parts. And so the fact that Amy shared some of our time with us is a real treat, and I hope you get a lot out of this experience. So yeah, and just to be clear, I was in no way involved with the show, right? It's Amy and her colleague that organized this. But being on the Living New Deal Advisory Board, when I learned about this exhibition, I was really excited about it for a number of different reasons. The first being is that I grew up in St. Louis, and SLAM, which we never called it back in the day, was sort of where I got bitten by the art bug, right? It's really part of my art. If I were Spider-Man, right, I would have been bitten by a radioactive bug in the basement of SLAM. So this is an institution that's sort of very, very dear to me. But the other thing about this is that, museums, if you don't know much about them, they do these collection exhibitions all the time. Like they look through the vaults, they find material, and they try to come up with stories that based on what's sort of there. You don't have to do any loans, a little easier to coordinate, less shipping costs. And a lot of times it kind of feels thrown together, or it's, they're really straining to get this cool stuff to tell a story with it. And this particular show is one of the many reasons it's so nice is that it has a particular story of its own, right? It's not just this random assembly of objects. So I was thinking you could start off by talking about what we call the provenance of this collection, sort of where it came from and what its biography was that got it to SLAM, right, in 1943.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, John and Mary, and everyone associated, Elizabeth, our wonderful webinar, everyone associated with the Living New Deal. It truly is such an honor and a privilege to get to share this show with you and then everyone out there. Thank you. So, to start at the beginning, as John has suggested, so Claire and I, my co-curator and I, really took very seriously that we set ourselves a constraint first. So let me say, in a way, this show is kind of a pandemic project, and it's interesting to me to look kind of around the country. There have been a lot of shows on art of the New Deal in the last 2 years, something like that, and I feel like a lot of them kind of have a pandemic origin story of their own. That it was a moment when the world shut down. We really did look inward, as I think a lot of our colleagues did. And so Claire and I said, okay, we are going to focus on 256 works of art. Don't worry, they're not all in the show, but we're going to take that group as kind of our starting point. And so those 256 works came to SLAM in a way that a lot of museums received allocations of works from the WPA as it was closing down. So our director in 1943, our director at SLAM, got a letter from the distribution office in Chicago that said, "Would you like art?" And we said, "Yes, please, that would be wonderful." And so we'll go into this a little bit more later, but we actually asked for something specific. We asked for not only any works that they would want to send to us, generally, but we specifically asked for works by African American artists. And that was because SLAM was involved with opening a community art center here in St. Louis. And so that's just a teaser for something to come later. But that was how this group came to us. So we received 256 prints, drawings or watercolors, other kind of works on paper, and paintings. So a total of that equals 256. And they've been at SLAM ever since 1943. So that was our starting point for Claire and me. And then we had the fun of making selections. And so we'll go into that later. But we really wanted to stay focused on these objects that came in with this history. And so let me say that we have other works in the collection, either on loan from the federal government or by artists who worked for the Federal Art Project, for instance, say in St. Louis, but they didn't come through this particular group, this particular route. And so we said for us, nope, we are going to stay focused just on this group.
Yeah, so it's all one little happy family that all came at the same
Exactly.
time. I mean, basically the Works Progress Administration, right? It shutters in 1943, and so the government's got, and they own, right, these like the millions of artworks, and it's got to go somewhere. And so sort of established institutions are all contacted. And do you have any sense of like why you got the 256 that you did? I mean, I know you asked for, or your predecessors asked for work by African Americans, but do you have any sense of like why this particular group was picked?
It's a question that we have spent a lot of time trying to think about and a lot of time following the steps of, I think, a lot of you on the call doing research through the National Archives, through the Archives of American Art, right? I so wanted to find a list saying,
Right.
this is, crate 5 and 8, right? Or going to
the smoking gun. Yeah.
Precisely. Not so much. But it's been interesting to dive into the distribution records more that are held by the Archives of American Art in a particular collection of papers and really realize all of the decisions that were just kind of being made on the fly, the best the administrators could. So I feel like the works that by not African American artists felt somewhat the list of works that we received have a lot in common with what other museums around the country received. It seemed like they were numerous works or works that existed in great numbers for the prints, for instance. For the African American artists, I think, and I don't have the piece of evidence yet, but many of the works that are now at SLAM were exhibited in a traveling show that went to the Library of Congress, among other places, in 1941, celebrating the work of Black artists. And so I would not be surprised, even though this isn't written down in the distribution records, if those had been collected, had made their way back to the distribution center in Chicago, and were kind of sitting in a crate. And they said, oh yeah, that goes to St. Louis. But it is interesting, and we'll really get into this, we're seeing the Federal Art Project, and as John said, right, this is not a lone show. These are objects that are at SLAM. And so to think about the differences, that if this was a lone show, what were could we tell, for instance, more definitive stories, right? Like really trying to be a hard and fast word on, this is what Chicago looked like. This is what New York looked like. The Federal Art Projects there. We're not able to do that because we don't have, the range. But what can we say given the objects that we have? That's really where we started.
Thanks.
I'm sorry.
Always interested. Oh no, yeah. Put some
sharing images.
And people are probably like, "Where's the art already?" So we'll show some installation shots. And one of the other things I like about the show is that it really does reveal the wide range of programs that the Works Progress Administration sort of enfolded. So you've mentioned the traveling shows. That was a big part of it. A lot of you are probably thinking of public works of art, murals and sculpture that are decorating different kinds of federal buildings. There were community art centers, right, in which both there's adult education and children's programs. But mostly we think of these artists that are on relief rolls. So for the Works Progress Administration, a lot of artists, I'm doing the background 101 if you don't know much about the WPA, right? So the Works Progress Administration, one very small component is the Federal Art Project, or FAP. So the FAP is part of the WPA. Get confused very quickly, right? And so the idea is that this was meant to be a relief program. It's the Depression. Artists are especially out of work because no one, doesn't have money for food, much less luxuries, important luxuries, but luxuries like art. And so the idea is you had to qualify, you had to demonstrate need. You'd fill out paperwork. I think something like 90% of the people on the rolls had to demonstrate relief. You would send in examples of work, and then they would categorize you. There are these different kind of tiers. You were established to be, and if you had like a resume, you'd be seen as a professional. Then there's the skilled category, then intermediate, and then unskilled. So it's really a wide range of people with different kinds of training, right? Young and old, expert and amateur. And then they would allocate you to different kinds of programs. Only a select few are going to get to work in easel painting or in sculpture to kind of be full-time artists and get paid by the government a salary to do so. And then, of course, all that work remains federal property. But other people are going to be working as educators, as clerical staff, or in some other capacity. So most of the artwork we're going to look at today are artists that are on these federal rolls. And so maybe to help illustrate this, Amy, you can bring up some particular artists. Maybe someone who's on one end, the kind of famous professional, and then someone maybe who's not known today that was working in a different way for the program.
Absolutely. So I'm going to do that in kind of the reverse order based on
Great.
the order of the slides. And actually both of these works that I'll dive into are visible here in this installation shot. So we'll get into the details later about kind of the nuts and bolts of how we put the exhibition together. But just to say, to give you a sense of its scope, it's a 2-gallery show, about 60 works of art total. And so we're looking at one of those 2 galleries at SLAM. So to dive in, I love starting with Charles Davis as one of these examples of somebody who is not an artist who's not well known today, at least was not to me in any stretch of the imagination, but for whom his work on the Federal Art Project had a really significant impact on this time in his life. So he's based in Chicago. We're headed off to Chicago, and his WPA employment began in 1935, and I feel like it speaks really well to what John just described about the projects wanting to offer relief to people, but a whole range of kind of opportunities. So Charles Davis, who we're seeing here, began working for the WPA broadly in 1935 when he was assigned to work as a, quote, pick and shovel man at the airport. So not an artist at all. He told a reporter around this same time that his past jobs before he became an artist at the Federal Art Project had included a scrap iron worker, a porter, a waiter, a dishwasher, a laborer with the traveling circus, and a vegetable seller. But that, quote, I paint because it is the only thing I want to do because I love it. And so he managed to work and to continue to apply to join the Federal Art Project, to move from being a laborer to being an easel painter in this case. And so by 1938, he had joined the Federal Art Project, for which he painted mostly depictions like those you see in the photograph on the right. So scenes of, as he said, quote, real people and real places in his South Side neighborhood in Chicago. That obviously is not the painting that is represented on the left, which is at SLAM, and which we were really excited to include in this show. So he really struck off in a new direction with this work called Nocturne for Victoria. This moody and kind of mysterious or mystical painting in which he layered paint with glazes of oil and varnish, really experimenting with technique and with subject matter too. And And so we can think of perhaps his inspiration. He's in Chicago. He's taking classes at the Art Institute of Chicago.
Mm.
And so, what kind of European avant-garde artists he could have been looking at in the halls, either of the Art Institute or at local galleries in Chicago. And then how he's really pushing the bounds of how he paints too. He's working in a way that's not typical for his other paintings, which survive in small numbers. And so we chose this painting and wanted to include it, both to give it kind of its 15 minutes of fame, although I would love if it lasted longer than that, but also really to make the point about how the FAP allowed artists to experiment, not
Yeah,
only
exactly. Yeah.
to work as they might not have been able to as professional artists, but to strike out in new directions, because in order to qualify for that monthly stipend, they simply had to, I mean, simply, but they had to produce a painting, once
Yeah.
every so often. I mean, once a month, once every 6 weeks. And so if there wasn't if they didn't have to have a market, what could they do? And they could do things like this. And just a note, if anybody has ideas on the full interpretation of the title, Nocturne for Victoria, I am still looking for answers. So please, I'd love to talk more.
Yeah,
And
but when you have a
then,
buyer
yes,
guaranteed, right, it sort of frees you up to try your hand at DeCirico or whatever's happening here. So
precisely.
yeah.
That's exactly what I see too. And then perhaps an artist who, I mean, and we could talk more about if William H. Johnson, I feel like for us people who study American art or who just enjoy modernism broadly, he's well known, right? Maybe took a little while to obtain that reputation, but certainly somebody who came onto the program as a professional artist.
Mhm.
So here is William Johnson on the right. He by the 1930s, he had become really established as an artist working in Europe. As I know, I don't have to tell many of you on this call, but painting expressionist landscapes like those you see in this photograph. And so when World War II broke out in Europe, he returned, or just slightly before, he returned to New York City and tried to get on the WPA. And we will talk about this more, but his experience in New York was not an atypical one. So he is an African American artist, and so the New York City FAP, even though it was the largest federal art project in the country, it was largely segregated. And so even though Johnson really had the qualifications to, be able to work as purely an easel painter, very much as Charles Davis was assigned to work as an easel painter. In New York City, he instead received an assignment to teach at the Harlem Art
Yeah.
Center. But it had an unexpected and maybe, I mean, very exciting outcome. So this is the work that is in Slam's collection on the left, or at Slam on the left. But here is a context out of which it came. So we are looking at a classroom at the Harlem Art Center, and then just another work by Johnson, which of one of his classes that he taught
That's
there.
great.
And so we really love, I mean, he during this experience of teaching something like, around 100 students a week, I don't know, somewhere around there, many, many, many students, he really was inspired by their work, and went in a new direction in his own in inventing this new language of modernism.
Yeah, it's fantastic. He's got a traveling show up right now that originated at the Smithsonian American Art Museum, and I think has two more out of like 10 stops. So that's what is I was going to look this up for a second. Fighters for Freedom is the show if you're interested in his work. That show's going around the country. Yeah, and I want to talk about these community art centers and the role of many of these artists as educators, because they end up sort of triggering a whole new avalanche, right, of younger careers, and many names we actually know today. But moving from the FAP relief programs, they also set up these public art programs, works of art that were meant for public consumption. And these also were sort of relief based, although they typically went to the more professional category or tier of selectees. And so when I saw this, I was really excited because I knew the suite of murals that it was designed for. And so, yeah, I want to hear more about the Selma Day mural study that you have in the collection.
Absolutely. So, and let me also just pause to say, right, we could go on for like another 5 hours describing every single work. We have just
Yeah, we
kind of
want to
picked
leave
the
like at least
highlights. I know,
we want to
exactly.
leave like 20 minutes for Q&A. So if something comes to
Um,
mind as you're listening, we'll try to field your questions. Anyway, tell us about this study.
Yeah, so this to me is truly one of the most unusual works maybe in our group. But I am so excited about it for oh so many reasons. So one of them, I mean, maybe the primary one is that I feel like for Claire and my co-curator and me, if people came to our show, experienced what, it had to offer and left saying, huh, that changed what I thought WPA art or New Deal art looked like, we would consider it a win. Um, and so in thinking about that, I feel like many visitors have come in saying, well, I know post office murals, but what's this other stuff? And so really thinking about the importance of mural projects and public art projects, to in this period and to New Deal art projects broadly, we were very excited that we have one mural that could speak to these bigger projects, although it is a slightly unusual one. So what we're looking at is the work on the left that is at SLAM, and then a photograph of its artist, Selma Day, on the right, painting in the space that it was designated for. So let me go forward and to start talking about this really important Harlem Hospital mural project. So it was the first, so covering this building, or areas of this building with murals, was the first major commission awarded by the federal government to Black artists. And so you are seeing a lot of them here on the right. So including, so led by Charles Alston, but including really a range of names that you can see listed down there on the lower right. And so Selma Day, I think I have one more good image. So Selma Day was assigned to decorate the children's ward of the hospital. So she got one room, and then Georgette Seabrook, another artist, got the adjacent room. And so Selma Day painted a series of Mother Goose rhymes. And here, right, is another kind of set of walls in the room. So we think that Slam's mural study was produced by her as kind of a proof of concept. So a question that we get a lot, right, is what oversight did either regional directors at the Federal Art Project have, or kind of the federal government broadly, right? And so certainly muralists were subjected to kind of the most stringent or most intense oversight and approval processes. So we think that this study probably was produced under that guise as kind of a proof of concept. So if you compare it, so right, a question is, well, which rhyme does it represent? If we were in a room together, I'd make you guess. But since we're not, I will just tell you that we think that it is Little Boy Blue. Come blow your horn, the sheep is in the meadow, the cow is in the corn. And it's interesting to see kind of in the middle of the slide, we think that that is that she changed her mind as she kind of went forward to the ultimate commission, to the ultimate painting of the work. But we're really excited to be able to share this work, both to talk about the importance of this mural commission at the Harlem Hospital in New York City, but then also to be able to share artists who like Selma Day, right, who she studied at Brooklyn College, at the Art Students League, at Columbia University, worked at this moment on the Federal Art Project, but then afterwards her career took a little bit of a different turn. She worked in a kind of in advertising, and then eventually, and so in graphic design, and then eventually in interior design, and kind of had a big enough profile that she joined Jesse Owens in advertising cigarettes, Lucky Strikes, to an audience. Yes,
Sad sign of fame, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and we can come back to more about I think the Harlem Hospital murals. There's so many stories about it. Yeah, Charles Alston is the first kind of African American who was a supervisor for one of these mural projects. The superintendent of the hospital was upset that there was so much Negro subject matter. The artists union organized to protest, right? So it really gets tied up in all these different stories within the context of the New Deal that we can explore further. Yeah, and of course you could also talk about the fact that it was typical that oftentimes women artists were given spaces that were either female, like the nurses' lounge, right, or the children's ward, because they were thought to kind of have more of a natural affinity with the children. And this photo is the best thing ever, with all the little sleepyheads in their cage-like beds, slumbering away, haunted perhaps by these nursery rhyme images. So we've talked about relief programs, we've talked about these public mural programs, and I think we've already alluded to the fact in the case of William Johnson that there were these community art centers as well, right, where artists are being paid to teach. In some cases, adult educators or adult students, and in many cases, probably more, children's art programs. So some of the works in the collection seem to relate to that, and I'd love to hear more about that.
Yes. So I thought that I'd share just a few, well, one really, but others that we've glimpsed from Chicago, and then go on to kind of the bulk of our community art center
Yeah.
work. So, just very briefly to say that we have a few works in this group that were made by artists like Elzir Cortor, who went on to found the Southside Community Art Center in Chicago, which of course has the distinction of still being or being the only community art center founded with FAP support that is still operating as a community art center. Um, so both Cortor's work is represented, this really fascinating depiction of hardship facing his neighborhood. So he was a founding member and teacher. Charles Davis, who we met a moment ago, was also a teacher. And then we'll meet one more artist, Fred Hollingsworth, later on, who taught here as well. But to dive in a little bit deeper, keeping an eye on the time, to really I mean, again, something that we really shaped the show and organized the show once we get there in order to be able to show these works that are in SLAM's allocation. So, what we are looking at now is a group of 15 paintings that were all made by young artists, so aged 7 to 15, at the building in the center of the slide. So, that building, the gray building with the bluish roof, is the Lemoyne Federal Art Center, and that is located in Memphis, Tennessee. And so all of these works were made in 1938 in the very first years of this center running. And they were made by these young artists who were taking a creative children's art class for students who lived nearby, so in the neighborhood. So I hope what you can understand here is so the Lemoyne Federal Art Center is at that red dot. All of the purple little marks are where the artists who are represented in SLAM's allocation, who have works there, lived, and then just a couple of landmarks to reference Memphis. So, like many community art centers, the Lemoyne Federal Art Center was really established to expand the federal art project's reach into neighborhoods where there was less art or fewer opportunities to engage with works of art. And so this was a primarily African American neighborhood. Most community art centers were segregated, either by absolute design or by just kind of circumstance, although not the one in St. Louis. And so when we get there, I will explain the reason that these paintings are here at SLAM. But the question of kind of so in our show, we have 15 of these paintings represented, made in Memphis by these young artists at this community art center. The broader allocation contains 39 paintings total. So how did these 39 works come together and then make their way to SLAM? Well, so this I'm showing the verso, the reverse of this drawing on the right. So if you were to flip it over, this is the sheet, the cataloging sheet that you would find on its back, kind of pasted on its back.
So
oh my
clues.
Goodness. Thank you so much for people who were archivists and catalogers and did. So this is why we know the names of and ages and titles of the artists and their associated works. And it also provides a list of exhibitions where they were shown. So they traveled around essentially Tennessee, and then eventually went to Washington and eventually were shown nationally in a few exhibitions. But in this early 1938 moment, we think that these were kind of selected as, do I have a big one? No. So these guys were selected again, kind of as a proof of concept of, the most interesting works to come out of the first couple months of classes, and a demonstration of what good work was going on at this federal art Federal Art Center. And so
those probably toured, right? The kind of the choice selections that went on these tours the government is to the Library of Congress and elsewhere. Yeah.
Yes. And so we could not help I mean, we were so excited to get to know these 15 young artists whose works are in the collection. So only one of them went on to become a professional artist. Actually, I'll go back. So it is the one top row, one in from the left, with the kind of bright green grass and the woman doing laundry. So that is by Harold Lloyd Neal, who went on to become a professional painter in and educator in Detroit. Actually owned one of the first black-owned, or ran one of the first black-owned galleries in the Midwest in the
Yeah. Amazing.
1950s.
Yeah.
Completely amazing, and really talked about the experience that having his work, taking classes as a young man and having his work praised by adults. He said, "You keep doing what gets you praise," referring to this experience. So if you're curious to learn more about any of these artists, we have their biographies, so much as we've been able to, learn, available on SLAM's website. And I think Elizabeth might drop a link to the chat in there. But I wanted to share just one because it's such a good story. So, and such an exciting story about how really living, right, the Living New Deal is, how fresh these connections are. So as I was researching this list of artists, I was doing it in alphabetical order. And I came to Weldon Sugarman, who married and became Weldon Sugarman Smith. I start researching and realize that she had moved to St. Louis as a young adult, and married her husband here and settled down and raised her family in St. Louis. And so I keep looking, and this was in 2020, so I couldn't find an obituary then. You could see when she passed away on the slide. But I keep researching and realize I think she might still be with us. And I keep researching a little bit more and realize that she has been a SLAM museum member for decades. And so I cold call the number that we have on file. And to make a long story short, she was able to come
That's
and
amazing.
visit her painting. So this was a few years ago. We put it up. So as you can see, she passed away about a year ago. Well, maybe more now. Um, but just such a lovely demonstration, right, of the connections really that still exist through these works of art.
It's amazing. So yeah, so in addition to the Memphis Center, yeah, and I'm supposed to be context guy. So these community art centers, some were standalone institutions, and the ones that we typically know better, like the one in Harlem, the one on the south side of Chicago, and then actually one of the other ones was the People's Art Center in St. Louis, which, like Chicago, lasts beyond the lifespan of the Living New Deal, at least through the 60s or so, I believe. And so it sounds like you mentioned this earlier, one of the reasons that all this work by African Americans was sent to St. Louis is because they asked for work for this art center that the New Deal had piloted or launched. So I think people would maybe love to hear about that institution and its connection to SLAM.
Absolutely. So what we are looking at here on the screen, and I probably should have blown up the things in those red boxes, but are these distribution records. So, right, held by the National Archives, but available on microfilm through the Archives of American Art. And so I hope you can see. So this is a list of the works that were allocated to SLAM. But we have, we saw all of these sheets, there are lists that are going just to the St. Louis Art Museum, which was then called the City Art Museum, if you see that anywhere. And then this list that says for use or in use at the People's Art Center, St. Louis, Missouri. So the People's Art Center, because of its tax status or kind of institutional organization, wasn't able to receive an allocation directly, but SLAM had been very involved in its founding. Our director was the president of the board of the People's Art Center for a long time, and various SLAM staff members actually taught its classes. And so the agreement was made that these works would come to SLAM and then they would be available for use in the People's Art Center. We are still doing research to determine if and when these actually left the building for that purpose. It seems like many of them didn't, although other things were loaned to the People's Art Center. But let me go forward to show you an image of it. So, in kind of terrible timing, the People's Art Center was opened in 1942 with federal support. Of course, all New Deal arts programs ended in 1943. So just as John said, the center was able to fundraise locally and really kept going into the 1960s. But its kind of moment, there was a challenge right away. But one of the things that was unusual about this center is that it was from the beginning meant to
No.
be integrated.
Right.
And so that certainly set it apart from many other art centers, even though in many ways it was very similar. And John, I will set you up for your next show and tell.
Yeah, and so yeah, this is super interesting to me because growing up in St. Louis, no idea that these. I went to Slam repeatedly as a child, and I guess this predates my time on Earth, but it's an amazing story that needs more airing out, and I'm glad the show kind of touches on that. Yeah, so you
And just very briefly, if
yeah,
one
yeah.
is really interested more in this history, so Marianne Calo
Oh, yes, I brought it.
wrote this very smart book that has a whole chapter devoted to the People's Arts Center.
Yeah.
And I think she will be the next speaker in a webinar hosted by the Living New Deal next week, next month. Mary will
Yeah, when
provide
is that, Mary?
information.
Yeah,
It's March 25th. I'll say it
check
at
your
the end.
email.
But yes, coming up.
Yeah, so my interest in this material in the New Deal, and I'm really more of a Treasury section mural guy, is about the way African Americans were involved in these programs and how they were depicted and represented by these programs. And like the New Deal more generally, there's all these debates right now, like was the New Deal and the Roosevelt administration more generally, did they open up new opportunities for African American, or did they perpetuate different forms of discrimination and racism through the programs as well? And there's a lot of good evidence on both sides. So as you think about this particular collection and the show, I mean, what's your sense about whether this was a program that is really enabling artistic careers, or one that is sort of, because, on the one hand, you have these great stories about people becoming professionals because of their experiences as kids in these art centers that wouldn't have otherwise, right, been around. On the other, they're often marginalized in like educational jobs, right? They're not given the kind of role of being a full-time practicing artist. Or they're like having to work with children, right? Sort of associated with younger art makers. And so I don't know if you had, what's the show told you about this
New.
possible dilemma? Yeah.
I mean, I feel like because I was so, we, Claire, and me, we were so interested in kind of surfacing untold stories, right? And really, really telling histories of artists and their experiences that hadn't necessarily gotten this attention previously. I, I went in kind of with the glass half full viewpoint, and I think that if one just simply walking through our exhibition and or reading about it online, I think one might get that idea if one was a casual viewer. Um, uh, but that certainly doesn't mean that there isn't this that one should ask these questions, right, as well. And and yeah, and certainly, I mean, one of the kind of most direct examples of this is not only African Americans artists
Right.
experiences on the program. Oh, I'm so sorry. One more slide of People's Arts Center
Yeah.
images there, but also Asian American artists.
Mhm.
And so we really wanted to tell kind of both the positives of the opportunities that the Federal Art Project provided, to artists writ large, but also especially Asian American artists, but then also not shy away from telling the more complicated and really negative and aspects of this history. So, for instance, Mine Okubo,
Yeah.
settled in San Francisco, or born in San Francisco, studied at UC Berkeley, went to France and studied with Fernand Léger, among others, in kind of the mid 1930s. And as the war was breaking out, she left and came back and kind of immediately got on the project, where she produced this screen print using kind of this emerging printmaking technology that had been
Oh, I
in
think
long
we.
use.
Oh, sorry.
Yes, please,
No, no,
John,
no, no, nothing.
please.
Sorry, it's my. Keep going. Keep going. I'm sorry.
No worries. But had so really inspired by kind of experiments that artists were doing in screen printing workshops, adopting it as a fine art medium, not just a commercial medium, in New York and Chicago. So made this work that is uh, available in many collections out there across the country. But then soon after, because she was Japanese American and living on the West Coast, she and her entire family were placed in an internment camp. And so, again, just for sake of time, and also because other scholars have done this work that I am just excited to get to share, there is a wonderful exhibition about Okubo and two other Japanese American women at the Smithsonian American Art Museum right now that really tells their histories and their longer careers in just a beautiful way. So Okubo, and then just to share one more very briefly, Chuzo Tamatsu, who was a little earlier, or a little older, generation older than Mine Okubo, who was born in Japan, and had immigrated to the United States and settled in New York City in the 1920s. And so he was among the first artists, or early artists, to join the Federal Art Project in New York, where he worked very productively until 1937, when the requirements for being an artist on and getting federal funding changed. And so you had to be a US citizen. And of course, Japanese people of Japanese descent were not allowed to become US citizens until 1952. And so he was kicked off the rolls at that point. And so we have his work. I mean, and he continued then working as an artist after this period. But just the complicated stories too that U.S. governmental policy intersecting with the arts reveals.
And during a time when there's a lot of immigrant sentiment. Now,
Yes.
it's an important reminder. So there's a lot of ground we didn't cover, Amy, but I'm hoping maybe in Q&A, if people have questions about the opportunities and limitations on women artists, on Asian American artists, if you want to get into how and why the show is organized, if people are curious about that. I'm seeing a couple things in Q&A, and if you've got other questions, follow-ups, or anything that we haven't covered about this exhibition, please put them up there, and we'll do our utmost to get to them in the next 15 minutes. And so the first question I saw is a nice way to kind of remind people of the show's dates. Deborah Gardner was asking if the exhibition will be available online in its entirety. So when does the show close, and how can people see this material if they can't make it to St. Louis?
That is a wonderful question. Thank you. A very generous one. So April 13th, when I'm not going to make you all seasick by going all the way to the end of my slides, but we'll get there. And I have my email address there. If you are planning a trip to come see it, please reach out. Truly, seriously. So April 13th is when it closes, and such a good question about how to experience this online. So currently we have, so every work in the show is on our website, and it has its label text alongside it. But in terms of kind of a true, online exhibition, we are getting there. This will be our first one. So stay tuned, and maybe we can publicize it somehow through the Living New Deal or have a note in your newsletter. But it is something that we are actively hoping for and working on.
So then, yeah, and this relates to Barbara's question that just popped up here. Spectacular presentation. Thank you, Amy. Any chance the show will travel? So upset, I'm going through St. Louis in May. So I think, unfortunately, right, this is although all these works are in the permanent collection. So we hope, are there plans to keep any on view, or are they're gonna go back in hiding
Into
for a little
storage,
while?
that's a great question. So actually, sorry, I can go forward here just to give you a sense. So here's just an image of our selection process, but and the show is organized geographically. We could talk about that. Here we go. So here's kind of the range of what the show is. So because there are so many works on paper, they're going to go rest after their time in the light. But of course, they're always available. We're happy to pull them out. Those paintings, many of them are going to go back into our permanent collection galleries. But truly, we have kind of packets of both checklists and interpretive text that I would be delighted to send to anybody who would be interested in seeing them. I would be excited to do that.
Jim asked the first question, and I feel we should double back to him. He asks how you can explain how segregation worked in the New York program, what art union protested. I can answer the second part, which is that the artists' union was established. Now that all these artists are working for the same employer, I mean, before this time, they're independent contractors. It's hard for them to organize. And so the FAP allows them to kind of all band together, and they're involved in several actions, including they protest, right, the way that Japanese and Chinese American artists are being taken off the rolls, right? They organize a campaign, unsuccessful, unfortunately. And also when there was this push by the superintendent of the Harlem Hospital that there was too much Negro subject matter, they took the case to Roosevelt and I think Mayor LaGuardia to kind of push back against it. And in that case, they were successful. So in terms of the segregation of the arts program itself, I don't know, Amy, if you have more information. I think the classes were segregated by race, is my understanding.
Yes. And it was something so, I mean, I have to say something surprising to me. I should also say that this is my first foray into your world, into the 1930s and
Wow.
40s, and or many of your worlds. And so I went in thinking like, oh, well, so let me back up just to say we decided to organize the show by geography. So to group, to really make a point about the regional character of artistic production. And that so many of the decisions of which artists got on the rolls, what their experiences were like, the kinds of workshops and spaces that they worked in were really regionally determined. So, the experience of being an artist in San Francisco is very different to being an artist in New York City. So because Chicago is kind of our closest neighbor in this map, I really started there. And there are many African American artists, not on the first, not in 1935, working in the easel project, but by 1937, 38, there was a change in supervisor, and many of them were able to become easel painters or work in the easel division. And so I just assumed that the same thing would be true in New York City. And I was surprised to find that it wasn't. And I am sorry that I do not have a great answer to that question about really why, because there certainly were any number of African American artists working in New York at that time. But if you out there do, I'd be very grateful to learn.
There was a question coming from, I know this is a little out of order, but David Levine was asking about whether or not this material is going to be included on the new Living New Deal website or link to it. So Mary, I think you wanted to field that one real quick.
Yeah, I'll just chime in. Something that the Art Initiative hopes to do in the future, but we haven't begun to do yet. In some cases, I think there are small instances of this, but at the moment, Living New Deal documents physical sites rather than portable artworks, which is to say murals that are installed or sculpture that's installed in post offices or in public spaces that's sort of permanently installed. Those are the kinds of things that we tend to document. There is on the Government Service Administration's, the GSA's website, a new database that's released a couple of years ago that has many of the works that are on permanent loan to various museums, probably
You have a slide, yeah,
including
Amy?
SLAM.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry,
And
Amy, Amy has a slide of this, I think, yeah?
Wait, I'm
yeah.
so sorry. I was looking at a question. Say that once
Oh,
more.
the GSA. Do you have the slide of the
Yes.
GSA to
Oh
put
my
up for
gosh,
the
I
people?
definitely
Okay,
do.
sorry.
Okay,
Keep
we're
going,
just
Mary. Sorry.
there we go.
Uh,
Thank you.
Yeah, so the GSA has a database of portable art. So federal art in
What did I just do?
non-federal collections was kind of the original project, and they have a digital database that you can search and see works in various museums. It's not all of the works that have been loaned, but many of them. So Living New Deal, we're a small organization, but what you're suggesting or what you're asking about, something we hope to do and are slowly beginning to think about and hopefully making our way towards.
All the more reason the Living New Deal needs your support. I'm going to bundle three questions about the representation in the show. Someone wanted to know about the African-American Boston resident and artist Alan Crite. He is in the show. He's actually the poster child if you go to the website for the exhibition on the SLAM webpage. He's getting a big retrospective in Boston in a couple of years, so that's exciting. Amy, do you know if there are any Native American artists represented in the show? And then Deborah Gardner asked about immigrant artists that were incorporated into the show. We've talked about Japanese American immigrants, but there were probably other immigrants in the show as well. So Native American immigrants.
Yes. Fabulous. I love this. And so excited about the Alan Rowan Cright show coming up in Boston soon. So Native American. So this is why we at the beginning, right, said like, well, it's just this allocation. So in this allocation, that Slam received, there were no Native American artists. However, I am so grateful to be able to share that Slam recently received a very large gift of modern Native artists' work. And included in that is a mural panel by the artist Tonita Pena. Um,
Ooh,
and it is extraordinary.
yeah, she's a big deal. Yeah.
She is a big deal. So this show is going to be traveling. The show of this Native American collection is going to be traveling. The tour is being arranged. But if you go to Slam's website and search for Pena, Pena, you will see an image of this work. And so it's a topic that we had a lot of conversations about here at Slam as we were proposing this show, because we were, by the terms that we set for ourselves, we were limited to just these, 256
Sure, of
objects.
course. Yeah.
But we really did leave out oh so many stories, and especially of Native American artists.
Yeah, no, and that's partly the New
Yeah.
Deal. I mean, they sort of shunted Native American artists into the Indian Arts and Crafts Board. So there's an entirely different architecture for that, run out of interior. And so, there wasn't as much cross-pollination as there really should have been. They were expected to be making more kind of traditional, right, or neo-traditional artworks. So I think that's another relic of the program.
And then just very briefly, I love the question about other immigrant artists. So you can see the number here on the screen. So really those are kind of after Asian American artists. The largest group came from the New York Federal Art Project, and were immigrants who came from Russia or kind of Eastern Europe broadly. And they were among the artists who made kind of the most socially engaged prints in the collection. Just wildly generalizing. But we really found it, we really wanted to tell immigrant stories as much as we could through our selections.
And of course, different kinds of immigrants from different countries are having very different experiences, obviously.
Definitely.
David Levine and Gray Brecken are both asking questions about whether other institutions are doing something comparable, right, in terms of like going through storage and recovering this material and putting it on. I'm not immediately familiar with any, but I hope there's more of this.
Well, I can think of two shows, and this is probably not helpful because these are in the recent past rather than the upcoming future. But the Met last year did a show called, 2 years ago, called Art for the Millions, which incorporated a lot of the same material and has a great catalog that is still out there, and very much, I mean, not entirely collection based. I think there were some loans to that as well. But then the Baltimore Museum of Art did a really interesting kind of slice of their allocation, focusing really just on women artists and women artists depicting kinds of labor specifically, which I have to say, so we are trying to make the most of Slam's 200 some works. Baltimore and many other museums, but Baltimore has like 2,000 works that they received. And so they could really kind of, tell a little bit more specific stories, maybe. But isn't there a project coming up in San Francisco? Am I just totally making this up? I might be totally making this up. Drop something in the chat that is smart and good. There was certainly a project in San Francisco. That's what I'm thinking of. These are not very useful answers. But
it is the anniversary. We're 90 years out, and I think again the pandemic is obliging people to kind of go through the attic and see what's there that needs to be aired out.
Yeah, and it certainly makes me wonder, if for anybody who has been to see a number of these shows, is there anything that can be kind of collectively said, right, about what our current moment's interest in this material looks like?
I mean, the very idea of a robust government support for the arts continues to be a source of great debate and always seems to be under threat in one way or the other. Now, what else do we have here in the Q&A? A lot of nice compliments.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yeah, go ahead, Mary.
Of you, Amy. So what has the reaction been like? When I joined L&D, I went to see the Dykstra Collection exhibition at the Crocker Art Museum in Sod and its other venues as well. And I was struck by this one visitor who I think was like dragged to the museum reluctantly by his partner, that came across a work that reminded him of his dad. It was like a painting of a welder, and it connected to his working class identity. And it just struck me that this art, hits people in ways that are really powerful. So I wondered what the response has been to your show from the community and from visitors.
That's such a beautiful question. Thank you. Um, I mean, I feel a little biased to say it's been generally positive. Um, so I feel like the number one response that we've gotten is, wow, that's not at all what I was expecting. Which I take as kind of the highest praise, because we really were trying to represent a range of styles and a range of artistic experiences. Um, After that, though, honestly, the kind of second question or the second response we get regularly is, I'll go back one if I'm still here, is where is St. Louis? Why isn't St. Louis represented? And indeed, in this allocation, we do not have works from St. Louis, which is a whole story on its own, um, connecting to basically state politics, more or less. There was a federal art project in St. Louis, an Index of American Design kind of office, and there were murals made in St. Louis, and definitely the PWAP, the predecessor to the federal art project,
Yeah.
had a big role in St. Louis. We just kind of fell through the cracks a little. I'm sure there are going to be St. Louisans out there who are annoyed at how I am describing that.
Yeah,
Um,
Helen Harrison asked about other New Deal art in St. Louis, and my favorite is the post office, the main post office in St. Louis. Edward Millman and Mitchell Cyprian had this amazing kind of people's history, right, of Missouri that includes like John Brown and the expulsion of the Mormons, and the Dred Scott case, and other really complex and troubling aspects of American history. So that's my pitch. Go see that. Sorry, keep going,
Um,
Amy. Yeah.
and then just after that, just a shout out to wonderful colleagues at SLAM in our learning and engagement department who have done just a ton of work connecting with local schools with the children's paintings. And so we have a kind of secondary exhibition in another space of works made in response to the children's paintings. So it's been a generally positive response. Yeah. Thank you.
Well, that's nice. That kind of keeps the legacy of the New Deal going, right? In terms of trying to cultivate, love for the arts in sort of the next generation.
Yes.
Powerful to think of as a child, to think of the possibilities of becoming an exhibiting artist. Right.
Well, and as I said, slam is why I'm an art historian. I can say, right? It's kind of my patient zero for
Living New Deal, living
Oh.
Slam legacy. I think on that note, we're kind of at the hour. So I don't know if there's any other question, John, that we should answer.
I'm trying to say of the 19 we got, we fielded many, but not quite all of them. I mean, there's some really good suggestions in terms of, yeah, if you're really interested in sort of African Americans' experiences sort of in the New Deal, again, Marianne Kalo's book, I think Deborah Gardner also mentioned it, kind of it recounts. It wasn't just like St. Louis and Chicago and Harlem. There were like, I think she documents at least a dozen, almost 2 dozen different community art centers, some of which were standalone institutions, right? The People's Art Center, and others were what were called Negro Extension centers. And so they're attached maybe to an HBCU, for example, or some other kind of community center. And those didn't maybe last as quite as long, but they also were able to kind of, cultivate. And a lot of them were children's classes and were segregated, but nonetheless, there were not other opportunities for folks in that community to take art classes. So I think that's an important legacy as well.
And Marianne Kalo and Carrie Watson, another Florida-based scholar and scholar of American art, will be joining us for a webinar on March 25th. So we will have information about that in the webinar section of the Living New Deal website, and we warmly invite you to join us for that conversation next month. I will take this opportunity to thank Amy and John so much for this lively discussion and presentation of New Deal history and New Deal curatorial work. We thank you so much for being part of this webinar tonight. I'd also like to take the opportunity to thank our donors who so generously support our public programming, the development of our website, and all that we are able to offer to the general public in the absence of a museum dedicated to the New Deal, a scholarly unit dedicated to the New Deal, a scholarly journal dedicated to the New Deal. We're kind of one of the engines that could. So thank you so much to the generosity of our supporters. Thank you to our speakers. I will see you all on March 25th for our next webinar. Take care. Have a wonderful evening. Good night.
Thank you.